And why are you here today?
Okay. Well, it sounds as though you know quite a lot about me already, so I'm not sure I need to say a great deal, but because I have this family link that you've learnt about to the Sandhouse and the people who made the Sandhouse, I became interested in it many years ago, about 40 years ago actually. I started researching it to try and find out as much as I could about the subject. And then eventually that resulted in the book that Mr. Shepherd has there. In fact, there was another book, a smaller book, a few years before that one. And then as we found out more information, we were able to write that bigger book, and that came out back in 2010. And the story really goes on. We keep finding out more and more, and it just gets more and more interesting. And I'm delighted that you found the subject interesting today, and I'm really keen to hear what the questions are that I'll be answering, or trying to answer.
Fantastic, thank you. So, we're going to take the questions that we've had at the front that you've asked, and then at the end we'll open out for more questions. So, Iris, do you want to start for us?
How are you related to William and Henry?
How am I related? Okay, so first of all, William was Henry's father. William Senior was Henry Senior's father, and then Henry Senior was my great-great-grandfather. So that's actually my grandmother's grandfather. That was Henry Senior. So quite a long way back. And then William was his father, you see.
Fantastic.
So
Okay,
William was my great-great-great-grandfather.
How does it feel to be related to the creators of the Sandhouse?
It feels wonderful because it is such a fascinating subject, and it was really unique. I know you've seen pictures of it earlier on, and I'm sure you would agree that there's nothing quite like it. Certainly there's nothing like it in this area, and in fact there's nothing else quite like it anywhere else in the world as far as I've been able to establish, and been able to unravel the story of that and share it with lots of other people, such as yourselves, has been really fantastic. Thank you.
Iris.
Did you see the carvings on the house before the council built it?
Right. I never saw the house because the house itself was destroyed. I think you will have learned, I think, that it stood in a quarry, so in a big hole in the ground, and that hole in the ground was filled up again and buried whatever was left of the house around 1938. So although I'm old, I'm not quite old enough to remember the house itself. But then you're perhaps aware that the tunnels that had the carvings in, they were close to the house, but not in the house itself. And so those tunnels survived much later than the house. And yes, I did get the chance to go into tunnels just before they were finally filled in. And that was in 1984. So still quite a long time ago, really. Well, it's coming up to 39 years since I actually went down and looked at those some of those carvings. But yeah, I was able to see some of the ones that you've seen pictures of. It was a fantastic visit.
Alex.
Why did they build over the Sandhouse?
Yeah, well, lots of people ask that. Why would they destroy it and then build over it? I guess the first thing to say is that they didn't destroy it and fill it in order to build, because there was a long time, about 30 years after it had been filled in, before any building work took place in that immediate area. But back in the 1930s, the house had become, it wasn't a great place to live in. People were expecting better conditions for the houses by the 1930s. And the owners of it, Doncaster Corporation, they no longer had any real practical use for it. So it stood empty for a few years. But back in the 1930s, people really didn't value history and heritage like we do these days. When we see old buildings and old churches and whatever it might be. They're a great link to the past, to our history, and people really tend to value those things these days. And there's lots of legal protection for old buildings these days as well, which there wasn't back in the 1920s. And so, because it didn't have any real practical use, it was allowed to go to rack and ruin, and then the roof was taken off and it was all filled in, and it was very sad.
So related to that question, Richard, is the next one from Iris.
What did they look like?
What did the statues look like? Well, there were so many different ones. I'm sure you've seen some pictures of them. I saw some of them when I went down into the tunnel, but most of them had been quite badly damaged by the time I went down. One that I saw, have you seen pictures of the cherub today?
Yeah.
With a wingspan and the sort of flowers and leaves issuing from the crown that the cherub was wearing. When I went down into tunnels, the tunnel had been filled part way up, but there was still some space above, and so we could just see the top of the head. Well, about halfway, I think it was about halfway up the face of the cherub and the crown and such like, but we couldn't see anything below that because it had been filled in. I also saw what was left of the elephant and mahout. You could make out the shape of the elephant, but the mahout, the sandstone that formed the mahout, had been broken away and damaged, so you could see where the mahout had been. That's the elephant keeper. But you could make out the shape of the elephant. And I saw the carving of the king. That was probably in the best condition of all the ones I saw. Did you see pictures of Pat and Biddy?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, they weren't visible when I went down there because that part of the tunnel had already been filled in right up to the top. But apparently they were really impressive. They were really tall. Pat was about 3.5 metres tall. So what would that be? Up to where this loudspeaker is, more or less, the height of Pat. And Biddy was a little bit shorter, but not much. Probably up to the top of that roller shutter door, something like that. So they were very impressive. So, but there were also carvings of kings and queens and lots of other abstract carving, if you like, not specific subjects, but just shapes. So yeah, there was a huge variety, and they were all pretty wonderful.
Brilliant. Alex.
How long did it take to write the book?
How long did it take to write the book? Well, as I mentioned, we wrote a smaller version of the book first back in 1988. And I suppose most of the time goes into doing the research and getting the information and the pictures together, that sort of thing, to go into the book. The actual process of writing it probably took a few weeks. And then when it came to bringing out the second edition, the one that Mr. Shepherd's got there, because we had far more pages that we could fill, but we'd found out a lot more since the first book. Again, it was a matter of probably a couple of months, maybe 3 months, to do all the additional writing and put it together into a sensible sequence to tell the full story of the sandhouse. Thank you.
Alex?
Yes,
Iris, I'm sorry. Iris.
Have you ever drawn or made a model of a sandhouse?
Have I drawn a model or made a model? I have made a model of the sandhouse. Let me talk about a drawing first of all. I'm not very good at drawing personally, so I've never really tried, other than some very simple diagrams, if you like, which some of which appear in the book to illustrate how the house evolved, how it came into being. But other people have made gentleman who I know submitted a drawing which is now in the Doncaster Civic Trust calendar this year of the Sandhouse, which is a really detailed pen and ink drawing looking at the back of the Sandhouse, and that's the best drawing of the Sandhouse that I think I've ever seen. In terms of models, there's a few years ago I made a sand model, quite a big area, probably about over 2 metres long and about a metre, just over a metre wide, some compacted sand, and then dug that out in the sequence that we think the original ground where the Sandhouse was dug out, and photographed it as we went and filmed it so we could put together a stop motion video of how the house came about. So that was the sand model.
So we saw that this morning, didn't we, in the presentation?
Oh, you saw the time-lapse video of that? Yeah, excellent, yeah. So that was, in fact I did 2 versions of that. I did a small one, and then 2 or 3 years later I think we did a bigger version. So we've had a go at modelling.
Fantastic. Alex?
Are you going to make a new book?
Am I going to make a new book? Well, I've no plans to do that at the moment. For another book, I guess there would need to be a lot more new information to go into, to add on to what we already know, to make another book worthwhile. And while we've certainly found out more since 2010 when that particular book came out, we have found out more information. I'm not sure that there's really enough extra information at the moment to make it worthwhile to do a 3rd book. But I wouldn't rule it out completely. You never know, it might happen one day.
You're going to make a book, aren't you? 'Cause we're making a children's book, aren't we, about it with your working. So the next
That's
book
true,
about the Sandhouse
Yeah,
will have your writing in it.
of course, yeah, yes.
Okay. Iris?
Who is the person?
Who was the person, sorry?
Who wrote the book?
Oh, the person who wrote the book is a man called Peter Tuffy, and he's written lots of books about local history in Doncaster and the surrounding area. And when I was first interested in this subject back in the 1980s, he actually got in touch with me because he heard I was researching it, and he had an idea for some time to try and write a book about the Sandhouse, but never felt that he'd got enough information, and so we worked together on that first book to produce that. And then when I thought the time was right for another book, I got in touch with him again. In the meantime, he'd written lots of other books on different subjects, most of them to do with Doncaster area. And then we worked together to produce that second book.
Great. Is there another question, Alex? Or you?
How many years did the Sandhouse stand for?
How many years did it stand for? Well, I've got to just remember the difference. It's about 80 something. The first reference that I've ever found to the house existing was in April of 1857, and it was actually in a document called a conveyance, which had all to do with somebody selling a house to someone else. And it was when William, who we talked about earlier on, my great-great-great-grandfather, sold this area of land to his son Henry. And it describes a tenement, which is a house basically, cut out of rock sand, recently converted by Henry Seymour into a dwelling house. So that was April 1857. And as I mentioned, the roof was taken off and it was all filled in around 1938. So, it's 1938 minus 1857, which is 81.
Something like that. Fantastic. Iris?
Do you feel like you know everything there is to know about this?
Definitely not. I feel as though I know an awful lot about the Sandhouse. I I think I can probably safely say I know more about Sandhouse than anybody else alive. But there's always new things to learn about. There's other things I'd like to definitely know more about. We know the names of the families who lived in there after the senior family moved out. They moved out in 1900. And we know there were 3 other families lived in there over the next 34 years. I know quite a lot about the Hague family who lived there from 1900 to 1917 to 1932. I don't know much about the family before then or the family after that. So I'd like to know more about that. And there's lots of other aspects of it I'd like to know more about. So yes, I think it can keep me busy for a long time. Yeah. Good question.
Okay, last question from Alex. Which is your favourite?
My favourite is music.
Go on then.
How deep was the sand house?
How do I...
How deep was the sand
Oh,
house?
how deep was the sand house? Okay, so if you imagine, hopefully you've now grasped the idea that it was dug out of the ground. So this quarry, a big hole in the ground, was extended and left this massive block of sandstone in place, and then hollowed that out to form the roof. So from the original ground level, before any digging took place, down to the base of the house, that was about 9 metres, so about 30 feet in old measurements. So that's something like twice the height of this room. So if you imagine the ground surface being twice the height of this room up above us, we would be standing more or less where the bottom of the house was. Does that explain it for you?
And then the tunnels were even further down, is that right?
The tunnels were, the tunnels were on a similar level.
Similar level, yeah.
The
Okay.
tunnels were under the ground that was next to this quarry. So the one called the cloisters, which had all the fantastic carvings in, the floor of that tunnel was at a similar level, maybe very slightly lower, a metre or so, no more than that, lower than the base level of the house. And they did vary slightly in level, but they were similar to the quarry floor level.
Fantastic. So thank you to Iris and Alex.
Yes, thank you.
Good questions and well read.
Yeah.
Do we have any more questions in the audience?
Ooh,
Oh, lots of questions. Go on then, Isaac.
What was if the sandstone fell and you're suffocated? Could that ever happen?
Was it dangerous down there?
It was dangerous. In fact, as I've said, it started off just as a quarry, so the senior family were digging out the sandstone and loose sand to sell it for various purposes. And quarrying and that sort of work, it is still to this day is a dangerous occupation, much safer than it used to be. But for example, there was one incident, I forget exactly, but it was back in the 1800s. I think it was about 1860s, when one of Henry's sons, called Arthur Senior, he was working in the quarry, and a big lump of sand and sandstone fell on him and trapped him and badly damaged his leg, and for the rest of his life he had a severe limp because of the damage that this had done. So that's just one example. I'm sure there were other accidents, later on there were reports of bits of sandstone coming away within the tunnels as well.
Maybe?
Are you the only person related to a property building?
Good question.
Am I the only person related to them? No, there's lots of descendants of Henry Senior who were around. I'm related. It was Henry's daughter was my great-grandmother, then her daughter was my grandmother, then her daughter was my mother. So I'm related down the female line, if you like. But there are people around who still have the Senior surname who were related down the male line. So yeah, there were lots. I've got a big family tree of the descendants of Henry Senior that includes about 300 people so far, I think. Not all still around, but some of them.
Brother?
Are you the only person alive that's kind of all this?
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
Are you the only person alive who can remember all of this?
Okay. Well, as I said earlier, I think I probably know more about the Sandhouse than anyone else because I've spent so long being interested in it and researching it. I mean, a big part of what our charity, the Sandhouse charity, is trying to do is to just make as many people as possible aware of the Sandhouse and what it was like and all the rest of it. And so more and more people are finding out about it.
So if there's a book and if it's in the museum, then more people will know about it and they don't have to rely on Richard telling them because there's a book and there's a museum and all those things which will carry on down the years. Yeah? That's one reason why people write books and make museums. Over here.
They touched on the statues. And you know, I can't remember when I was down there whether I actually touched any of them or not. I probably did. Yeah, the sandstone is, as you'd imagine, I guess, it's quite a rough feel to it. But it's also, that sandstone is quite soft. And so if you rub it, even with your fingers, you get little grains of sand falling away. You know, it's not really hard stone like some types of rock are. But yeah, honestly, I can't remember whether I did touch one, but I suspect I probably did. It was probably the elephant as well.
Yes.
Are you the only person who's gone in the Sandhouse?
I'm the only person who's gone in the Sandhouse, you see. No, as I say, 4 families lived there, so the Senior family lived there for over 40 years, and then these other 3 families at different times up until 1934. And then I've spoken in the last few years to people who actually went in the house before it was destroyed. But then the tunnels, they became, during the 1940s and 1950s, they became a great unofficial playground for the local youngsters, the local children who lived in that area, used to find a way in and play in the tunnels. So lots of people over the years went into the house and probably even more went into the tunnels. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm sure it was possible, quite easy to get lost in the tunnels. They didn't stretch for, well, actually we don't quite know how far they stretched. There were some, when Henry Senior lived there, he advertised the tunnels have been open to the public from time to time to come and visit, and he used to charge a small admission fee for that. And over the years you can see how he advertised a longer and longer length of tunnels for people to go and explore, and eventually it was up to 1,000 yards. So I imagine that you probably could have got lost. I mean, there would have been one main tunnel, but we know there were some areas which were like a grid of intersecting tunnels. So I think you could have become a bit disorientated in that area for sure. So yeah, and if your candle went out or your oil lamp went out, then goodness knows.
I think we'll just have 2 more questions. One more here.
Was there any natural disasters while the Sandhouse was built?
Any natural disasters while the Sandhouse was being built? Do you mean anywhere in the country or
Yeah,
just in that
I
area?
mean, like earthquakes and things.
Yeah, like if like some of it was fell or like broken down.
I can't think of anything, to be honest, that I mean, I'm sure they had all sorts of problems when they were actually digging out the rooms of the house. but in terms of natural disasters, I've never found any records of any flooding down there, for example, or anything like that. Because the sandstone is quite free draining, so I think the rainwater got away. So I've not come across anything like that.
We've got time for one last question over here at the end.
How did you find out that you were actually related to the person that made the sand house?
That's a great question to finish with. It was from my grandmother. That was my mother's mother. I decided in around the early 1980s, coming up to 40 years, that I wanted to find out more about my family history and people that I didn't know about further back from my grandparents. And so one of the first things I did was go and talk to my grandmother about what she remembered. And even though I'd heard about this, I'd heard this thing called the Sand House mentioned from being quite young, you know, when the family got together, but I didn't really know anything about it. And it was only through having those conversations with my grandmother about 40 years ago that I started to realise just how special a place it was, and also that nobody had really sorted the history of it out and written it down. So it was, yeah, through talking to my grandmother, and I think that raises a really important point that I think we should all try and speak to our parents and grandparents, and if they're still around, great grandparents, about what their life was like and what they remember, you know, before it's too late and they're not around to be able to talk to them, because they've got so much information that they carry around that I'm sure you would find fascinating.
Fantastic, and that's a really nice way to end. So, as Richard says, it's always a good idea to ask your parents, your grandparents, great-grandparents, what was it like when you were younger? I'm sure they've got lots to tell you, lots of stories and information that they can pass on. And they might just surprise you as some of the things that they know about or that happened to them. So, shall we give Richard a big clap?
Thank you all. I really enjoyed answering the questions, and thank you, Iris and Alex especially.